We begin now with the Trump administration escalating the legal battle over deportation flights of alleged gang members. The White House today blasting the judge in the case and others who have blocked some of the administration's actions.
That the judges in this country are acting erroneously. We have judges who are acting as partisan activists from the bench. They are trying to dictate policy from the President of the United States. They are trying to clearly slow walk this administration's agenda, and it's unacceptable.
Well, the judge in the deportation case is an Obama appointee and is now demanding more information about these two flights over the weekend, carrying alleged gang members ultimately to El Salvador. This is after officials failed to turn them around, Trump administration officials.
Hey, everyone. Dr. John here. So this is happening right now. Trump spent the weekend on Truth Social targeting not political opponents, but the federal judiciary itself. First, a specific judge who ruled against him, then turning on the Supreme Court justices he personally nominated and once celebrated as his greatest achievement. Legal scholars aren't calling it another chapter in Trump versus institutions. They're calling it an escalation into territory that should make everyone think carefully about where this road leads.
Donald Trump tried to send migrants from Myanmar, Laos, and Vietnam to South Sudan against their will. A federal judge stopped him, and now Donald Trump is on the attack. Quote, the judges are absolutely out of control. They're hurting our country, and they know nothing about our particular situations or what they're doing, and this must change immediately. Hopefully, the Supreme Court of the United States will put an end to the quagmire that has been caused by the radical left. Joining us now, managing editor once again at The Bulwark and MSNBC contributor Sam Stein. Susan Glasser is still with us. All right, Sam, sending these migrants to a third country against their will, it's never been attempted before, but Donald Trump is trying to justify this by claiming that these migrants are criminals, they're the worst of the worst, but we, again, haven't seen evidence of this. If they are the worst of the worst, why are we not seeing that evidence? Why would they not want to put that out there?
What triggered this volcanic eruption was a ruling that cut to the heart of something Trump desperately wants and has been willing to push boundaries to achieve. Judge Boasberg, a federal judge whose name Trump has now seared into the public consciousness through his attacks, issued a decision that exposed a scheme so blatant that the judge himself used language that left little room for interpretation.
Boasberg accuses Trump officials of boasting about defying the court's order, quote, deliberately and gleefully. He points to Secretary of State Marco Rubio retweeting a post that included a headline of the judge's order where the president of El Salvador wrote, oopsie, too late. Now, Boasberg says even though the Supreme Court tossed his order last month, that doesn't excuse the government from obeying it until the Supreme Court acted. He says the Constitution does not tolerate willful disobedience of judicial orders, especially by officials of a coordinate branch who have sworn an oath to uphold it. To permit such officials to freely annul the judgments of the courts of the United States would not just destroy the rights acquired under those judgments, it would make a solemn mockery of the Constitution itself.
The Department of Justice had launched an investigation into the Federal Reserve, specifically into a building construction project connected to the central bank. On its surface, an investigation into government construction spending might sound like standard oversight, the kind of thing a diligent Justice Department might pursue if there were genuine concerns about waste or mismanagement. But Judge Boasberg looked past the surface. He examined the evidence, the timing, the context, the statements made by administration officials, and the broader picture of what was actually happening between the White House and the Federal Reserve.
Federal judge has quashed a pair of grand jury subpoenas sent to the Federal Reserve Board. They were part of a criminal probe by U.S. Attorney Jeanine Pirro's office. And in his ruling, Judge James Boasberg said the subpoenas were a pretext to pressure Fed Chairman Jerome Powell to lower interest rates. Pirro responded to the judge's decision in a combative news conference. CBS News Justice correspondent Scott McFarland joins us live right now. Good to see you, Scott. Can you walk us through the judge's decision and what it ultimately means?
Oh, pretty blistering decision from Judge Boasberg, saying in so many words that these subpoenas shouldn't even move forward, much less a grand jury convene to consider evidence, much less a criminal case be filed here. The judge is also saying that this appears to be politically motivated by the White House, that there was not sufficient, if any, evidence of a crime.
His conclusion was devastating. The investigation was not a good faith inquiry into potential wrongdoing. It was a harassment campaign, a pressure tactic, a blunt instrument wielded against Jerome Powell because Powell had refused to do what Trump has been demanding for months: slash interest rates to levels that would make the economy look artificially robust heading into a critical election period. The backstory here is essential to understanding why this ruling landed with such explosive force. Jerome Powell occupies what might be the most pressure-cooked position in American economic governance outside the presidency itself. As Federal Reserve Chair, he controls the levers of monetary policy that determine how expensive it is to borrow money for a mortgage, for a car loan, for a business expansion, for everything that ordinary Americans and massive corporations alike rely on credit to achieve. Trump appointed Powell during his first term, presumably expecting a loyalist who would keep money cheap and the economic party rolling whenever the White House needed a boost. But Powell, from the moment he took the chair, has been something different. He has been an institutionalist, someone who genuinely believes that the Federal Reserve's independence from political pressure is not just a nice tradition, but an essential pillar of economic stability. He has made decisions based on data, on employment figures, on inflation readings, on the complex modeling that professional economists use to balance growth against the risk of overheating. And those decisions have not always aligned with what Trump wanted. In fact, they have frequently clashed, publicly and dramatically, with Trump demanding rate cuts that Powell and his colleagues believed would be economically irresponsible.
The president continued to dial up the pressure on Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell during a visit to the Fed today. President Trump has repeatedly floated the idea of getting rid of Powell and then backed off, but continues to press him to cut interest rates.
The president's public remarks and personal insults about Powell are a major departure from past presidents, and his approach has sparked questions about whether the Fed's independence could be undermined in the months ahead. Tensions were evident again today when the president and Powell got together late this afternoon in front of the cameras.
The tension has been building for months, a slow-boiling conflict between a president who views every lever of government as a tool for his political benefit and a central banker who views his role as fundamentally non-political. Trump has raged about Powell on social media, in interviews, at rallies. He has floated the idea of firing him, despite serious legal questions about whether a president can actually remove a Fed chair outside the statutory grounds for dismissal. He has blamed Powell personally for economic headwinds that were, in most expert assessments, the result of global factors and the lingering effects of the inflation spike. And through all of that pressure, Powell has not budged. He has maintained his course, kept rates where his analysis said they belonged, and politely but firmly ignored the presidential tantrums. That refusal, that institutional spine, is what led to the investigation that Judge Boasberg ultimately found to be a sham designed to make Powell's life miserable until he capitulated. The ruling itself is a document that deserves to be read in full because of how starkly it frames what the judge believed was happening. When a federal judge states on the record that a Department of Justice investigation had as its sole purpose the harassment and pressuring of an independent official, that is not a routine finding. It is an indictment of the entire chain of command that authorized and executed the investigation. It suggests that the Justice Department, under Attorney General Pam Bondi, either initiated or allowed to proceed an investigation that had nothing to do with law enforcement and everything to do with presidential pique. The implications cascade outward from there. If the DOJ can be deployed to harass a Fed chair who won't cut rates, what other independent officials can be targeted? What other institutions can be leaned on? What other decisions made by what other people can be influenced through the threat of federal investigation? The precedent, if left unchallenged, would fundamentally alter the relationship between the White House and every agency that is supposed to operate with some degree of independence from political interference. Trump's response to the ruling arrived over the weekend, a truth social barrage that seemed to grow more unhinged with each successive post. He called Judge Boasberg wacky. He said Boasberg was out of control. He claimed Boasberg represented exactly what judges should not be. He suggested, either directly or through heavy implications, implication, depending on which post you read, that the judge should be removed from his position. The language was not the careful, legally precise language of an administration that believes it has strong grounds for appeal and is confident the higher courts will vindicate its position. It was the language of fury, of someone who had been exposed in a scheme and was lashing out at the person who did the exposing. Think about the psychology of that response. If you genuinely believed your Justice Department had launched a legitimate investigation and a judge had incorrectly blocked it, your response would focus on the legal errors. You would cite the evidence that supposedly justified the probe. You would explain why the judge misinterpreted the law or the facts. You would announce an appeal and predict victory. Trump did none of that. He attacked the judge's character, his temperament, his fitness for office. The substance of the ruling went unaddressed because addressing it would require defending an investigation that a federal judge had just labeled a harassment operation, and that defense would be legally perilous and politically humiliating. But the Boasberg attacks were only half the story. In the same weekend posting spree, Trump extended his judicial wrath to an institution that he has traditionally treated as sacrosanct, the Supreme Court. The specific trigger was a recent ruling in which the High Court rejected his tariff plan, a decision that stung particularly badly because it came from a bench that includes 3 justices Trump personally nominated: Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, Amy Coney Barrett. These were supposed to be his justices, his legacy, his guarantee that the judiciary would bend to his will on the issues that mattered most. Instead, they applied the law as they understood it and ruled against him. And Trump's reaction was not to accept the ruling as the cost of living in a system governed by laws rather than men. It was to accuse the justices of openly disrespecting presidents who nominate them. Read that sentence again and let it sink in. The President of the United States is asserting that Supreme Court justices owe personal loyalty to the presidents who appoint them, and that ruling in ways that displease that president constitutes an act of disrespect. That is not a misunderstanding of how judicial independence works. That is a wholesale rejection of the premise. The reaction from the legal community has been swift and has carried a tone of genuine alarm that goes beyond the usual back and forth of partisan legal commentary. Experts interviewed by major news outlets in the days following the ruling and the subsequent attacks have used language that should concentrate the mind of anyone who cares about the stability of American governance. One legal expert, speaking to Scripps News, warned that Trump's escalating attacks on the judiciary risk eroding faith in the rule of law to a point that leads toward what they described as anarchy. That word, anarchy, is not being thrown around casually. It refers to a very specific and very dangerous scenario in which the legitimacy of the courts has been so thoroughly undermined that their rulings cease to carry binding force among a significant portion of the population. When that happens, when large numbers of people decide that judges are just political actors whose decisions can be accepted or rejected based on personal preference, the entire edifice of constitutional governance begins to crumble. The courts have no armies. They have no enforcement mechanism beyond the public's willingness to accept their authority. That acceptance, that shared belief that the judiciary is the proper forum for resolving legal disputes, is the invisible foundation on which everything else rests. And Trump is taking a sledgehammer to that foundation every time he dismisses an unfavorable ruling as the work of a wacky, out-of-control judge, rather than engaging with it as a legitimate exercise of judicial power that can be appealed through proper channels. The Federal Reserve dimension of this story adds a layer of economic peril that makes the judicial independence concerns even more urgent. The independence of the central bank is not some abstract academic concept. It has real, measurable consequences for the daily lives of every American who has a mortgage, a car payment, a credit card balance, or a job that depends on a stable economy. When financial markets believe that the Fed makes decisions based on economic analysis rather than political pressure, they price American assets accordingly. The dollar maintains its status as the world's reserve currency, in part because global investors trust that American monetary policy is not subject to the whims of whoever happens to occupy the White House. That trust translates directly into lower borrowing costs for the government, for businesses, for homeowners. It translates into the stability that allows long-term economic planning. The moment that trust is broken, the moment investors start pricing in the risk that interest rates might suddenly drop because a president demanded it rather than because the economy needed it, the costs start rising. Bond yields creep up, currency values wobble. The intricate machinery of global finance, which is built on assumptions about American institutional stability, starts to malfunction, and those malfunctions eventually show up in higher prices, fewer jobs, and slower growth. Trump, in his quest to force Powell's hand, is not just attacking one man or one institution. He's threatening the credibility architecture that makes American economic dominance possible, and the markets are watching. Judge Boasberg's ruling did not emerge from a vacuum. It is part of a larger pattern that has defined Trump's second term, a pattern of courts pushing back against executive overreach, and Trump responding by attacking the judges personally rather than engaging with the legal substance. Courts have blocked deportation policies. Courts have struck down tariff implementations. Courts have halted investigations that judges found to be legally deficient or politically motivated. And in every instance, the administration's response has followed the same script. Identify the judge, attack their character, question their motives, rally supporters against the judiciary as an institution, and make vague noises about appeal while primarily focusing on the public relations war. The cumulative effect of this approach is not just a series of individual controversies. It is the gradual, incremental delegitimization of the entire judicial branch in the eyes of a significant portion of the electorate. When the president, the most visible and powerful figure in American public life, repeatedly tells his supporters that judges who rule against him are corrupt or biased or out of control, he is not just venting. He is engaged in a long-term project of persuasion, convincing millions of people that the courts cannot be trusted to administer justice fairly. And once that belief takes root, it is extraordinarily difficult to dislodge, even when the political circumstances change. The Supreme Court angle deserves particular attention because of what it reveals about Trump's understanding of the judiciary's role. The conservative legal movement spent decades, entire careers, building the intellectual and institutional infrastructure necessary to reshape the federal courts. The Federalist Society cultivated generations of lawyers and judges committed to a particular vision of constitutional interpretation. Republican presidents from Nixon through Bush worked to fill vacancies with judges who shared that vision. The culmination of that project was the confirmation of 3 Supreme Court justices during Trump's first term, a generational victory that conservatives celebrated as the achievement of a lifetime. And now Trump is telling those justices publicly and angrily that their failure to rule in his favor constitutes disrespect. He is demanding not judicial philosophy or constitutional interpretation, but personal loyalty. He is treating the highest court in the land as an extension of his political operation rather than as an independent branch of government. And that creates an impossible bind for the conservative legal movement. Support Trump's attacks, and you're endorsing the destruction of judicial independence, the very principle that gives judicial decisions their legitimacy. Oppose them, and you're breaking with the leader of your political coalition. The silence from many conservative legal figures in the wake of Trump's Supreme Court attacks has been deafening, and it speaks volumes about the uncomfortable position they find themselves occupying. The practical question that hangs over all of this is whether the attacks are working, and the answer appears to be that they are working in exactly the wrong direction for Trump. Chief Justice John Roberts has previously issued statements pushing back against presidential criticism of the judiciary, rare and carefully worded interventions that signaled the court's institutional discomfort with being treated as a political punching bag. Reports suggest that behind the scenes, the level of concern among people who care about the long-term health of American institutions is rising. Financial markets, which are exquisitely sensitive to signals about institutional stability, are beginning to factor political risk into their assessments of American assets. Foreign governments, allies, and adversaries alike are watching the President of the United States attack his own Supreme Court nominees and are drawing conclusions about the reliability of American commitments and the stability of American governance. The attacks may feel satisfying to Trump's base, a cathartic expression of shared grievance against a system they believe has treated them unfairly, but the collateral damage is accumulating faster than the political benefits. The path forward from this moment is unclear, which is itself a source of concern. In a healthy system, a judicial ruling like Boasberg's would trigger a legal appeal, maybe a policy recalibration, and eventually a resolution through established processes. But Trump has shown little interest in established processes. His instinct is to escalate, to attack, to delegitimize, to frame every setback as the result of corruption or bias, rather than as a legitimate difference of legal opinion. That instinct makes resolution difficult because resolution requires some shared acceptance of institutional legitimacy. If every court that rules against the administration is dismissed as wacky and out of control, there is no court that can ever render a ruling the administration will accept. The logic is circular and ultimately nihilistic, and it points toward a future in which the judiciary and the executive branch exist in a state of permanent conflict, with neither side willing to acknowledge the other's authority. The human element of this story sometimes gets lost in the discussion of institutions and legal doctrines. Jerome Powell is a real person who has spent years in public service, making enormously consequential decisions under immense pressure, trying to navigate an economic landscape that has been uniquely challenging. Whatever one thinks of his specific policy choices, the idea that he should be subjected to a harassment investigation because he made decisions the president didn't like is fundamentally repugnant to anyone who believes that public officials should be evaluated on their competence and integrity rather than their political compliance. Judge Boasberg is a real person who took an oath to administer justice without fear or favor, and who examined the evidence in front of him and reached a conclusion that was undoubtedly uncomfortable to deliver. The Supreme Court justices Trump attacked are real people who have dedicated their professional lives to the law and who made a decision based on their best understanding of what the law requires. Reducing all of them to caricatures in a political morality play does violence to their humanity and to the institutions they serve. The broader public has a stake in this that goes beyond any particular ruling or any particular personality conflict. The rule of law is not a partisan concept. It is the mechanism by which a diverse and fractious society resolves its disputes without resorting to violence or raw power. When that mechanism is weakened, when people lose faith that the courts will treat them fairly regardless of their political affiliation, the alternatives are grim. They are the alternatives that have played out in struggling democracies around the world, where courts become just another arena for political combat rather than a neutral forum for dispute resolution, and where the losers in court simply refuse to accept the outcome because they've been told that the judges are corrupt. The United States has enjoyed a remarkable run of institutional stability compared to many nations, but that stability is not guaranteed. It requires maintenance. It requires leaders who value it above their own short-term political interests. And it is precisely that maintenance that Trump's weekend tirade neglected. The economic consequences of the Federal Reserve pressure campaign are worth underscoring because they connect this seemingly abstract institutional fight to the concrete realities of people's financial lives. Interest rates affect everything. When the Fed keeps rates elevated to combat inflation, mortgage payments go up, car loans become more expensive, credit card debt becomes harder to escape, and businesses delay expansion plans because borrowing costs are prohibitive. Trump understands this, and his demand for lower rates is rooted in the genuine economic pain that high rates cause. But the solution to that pain cannot be for the president to force the Fed chair into submission through intimidation and harassment. That approach might produce a short-term rate cut that provides temporary relief, but it would do so at the cost of destroying the credibility that keeps long-term inflation expectations anchored. If markets stop believing that the Fed will resist political pressure, they start pricing in higher future inflation, which drives up long-term interest rates, which makes mortgages and business loans more expensive, which creates exactly the outcome Trump claims to be fighting against. The irony is that the pressure campaign, even if successful in the short term, would ultimately make the economic situation worse. And the people who would suffer most are the very voters Trump is trying to please. The weekend's events have set in motion dynamics that will not be easily contained. Judge Boasberg's ruling will almost certainly be appealed, and the appeals process will keep the underlying issues in the news for months. Every court that reviews the case will be operating under the shadow of Trump's attacks on Boasberg, aware that ruling against the administration could subject them to similar treatment. That awareness is itself a form of pressure, a subtle but real influence on judicial decision-making that represents exactly the kind of political interference the system is supposed to prevent. Trump's Supreme Court comments will linger in the background of every case the court hears that involves the administration's policies, creating an atmosphere of tension between the branches that makes the already difficult work of constitutional interpretation even harder. And the financial markets, never fond of uncertainty, will continue to price in the risk that the Fed's independence is being systematically undermined, with consequences that will show up in bond yields and currency markets long before they make the evening news. The legal experts who are sounding alarms are not doing so from a place of partisan advocacy. Many of them have spent their careers studying the structural features of democratic governance, the institutional designs that make constitutional systems durable or fragile. When they use words like anarchy to describe the endpoint of the trajectory Trump is on, they are drawing on comparative historical knowledge, on the study of other democracies that have seen their judiciaries delegitimized and their rule of law eroded. The pattern is familiar: leaders who attack judges personally when rulings go against them, supporters who internalize the message that courts are just political tools, a gradual erosion of the norm that judicial rulings must be respected even when they are unpopular, and then eventually a crisis where the courts rule on something fundamental and the ruling is simply ignored because the legitimacy required to enforce it has been drained away. At that point, the constitutional system has ceased to function in any meaningful sense, and what replaces it is a raw contest of power. The question that remains is whether anything can arrest this trajectory. Institutional resilience sometimes comes from unexpected places. Republican senators who care about the long-term health of the judiciary might decide that silence is no longer tenable. Conservative legal figures who have spent their careers building the institutions Trump is attacking might conclude that personal loyalty to a president is less important than the survival of the rule of law. Financial market actors who see their investments threatened by institutional instability might start applying pressure through channels that politicians actually listen to. But the window for such interventions is narrow, and the forces pushing in the opposite direction are powerful. Trump has built his political identity around the rejection of institutional constraint, and his supporters have embraced that rejection as a core part of their political identity. Asking them to suddenly care about judicial independence or Fed credibility is asking them to abandon something that has become central to how they understand their place in the political order. The weekend meltdown, viewed from a distance, looks like a turning point, not because anything was definitively resolved, but because the scope of the attacks widened in a way that made the underlying pattern impossible to ignore. Trump going after a single judge who ruled against him is a recurring story. Trump going after that judge, and then in the same breath going after the Supreme Court justices he appointed because they also ruled against him, that's something bigger. It suggests that the conflict is not about any particular judge or any particular ruling. It's about the very existence of a judiciary that can say no to the president. And when the president decides that no judge should be able to say no to him, the constitutional system is facing an existential challenge that it has not confronted in quite this form before. The outcome remains uncertain, but the stakes are becoming clearer with each passing confrontation. A judiciary that is delegitimized cannot perform its constitutional function. A Federal Reserve that is politicized cannot manage monetary policy effectively. A system in which the president attacks every institutional check on his power is a system moving toward a form of executive dominance that the framers explicitly designed the Constitution to prevent. The weekend of Truth Social posts, the attacks on Boasberg, the attacks on the Supreme Court, the refusal to engage with the substance of adverse rulings, all of it adds up to more than the sum of its parts. It adds up to a presidency that is declaring, in word and deed, that it will not be constrained by law unless the law agrees with it. And that declaration, if it is not effectively challenged by the other branches, by civil society, by public opinion, by the very institutions that are under assault, represents a fork in the road from which there may be no easy return.